I think the length of the sermon is probably going to be roughly equal to the length of how long my voice can hold out. So you might be thankful for that. No dancing. This morning we're taking a look at 3 more moments of our Lenten journey from garden to glory. And for those who are not with us last week we started our Lenten journey, which is the season leading up to Easter. And so we're taking this journey where we're taking this walk through following Jesus from the Garden of Gethsemane to his resurrection in glory on Easter Sunday. And so in this season leading up to Easter, we're taking this time, like I said last week, we're walking through it instead of driving by it. And we're taking the time to take it one step at a time. So we're taking our journey around the sanctuary in a circle. And last week we talked about the garden. We talked about, I should quiz you instead of trying to remember myself, the prayer and the betrayal. We talked about the garden, the prayer, and the betrayal were our first 3 moments from last week. And this week we're talking about the Sanhedrin, the denial, and the judgment. So where we left our story last week, it's kind of like, the TV shows that say previously on. Previously on First Church of God. We talked about Jesus praying in the garden, his disciples falling asleep, and Jesus being alone during his prayer, during this anguish, the worst part of his life. Was this moment in the garden when he knew his death was coming. And then Judas came, one of his 12 disciples, came with the priests, the scribes, the teachers of the law. They came and he betrayed Jesus. He turned Jesus over to these people who wanted Jesus to be killed. And so Jesus was led away, and that's where we left our story last week. And so where we begin this week is with the Sanhedrin. And what's happening here in this part of the story is that after Jesus is taken away from the garden, he's taken to the house of Caiaphas, who is the high priest that year. And we're going to be talking about Caiaphas a little bit. And at the house of Caiaphas, he comes before this council. The council is the Sanhedrin. Now, throughout our studies in the book of Acts this year, you may remember we've talked about the Pharisees a little bit. Not too much, just a little bit. And we've talked about the Pharisees. Pharisees were the experts of the law. Pharisees were the people who in Jesus' time were interested in making sure that everything was just so. And so now, a lot of times throughout our study of Scripture and our study of Acts and Jesus' time, Jesus has some pretty strong language to use for the Pharisees and pretty negative terminology. The Pharisees were some of the members of this court of the Sanhedrin, who they were a religious ruling court of the Jews at this time. The thing to remember about the Pharisees is that their power was kind of limited at this time. At this time, Jesus' time, the Romans were in charge in modern-day Palestine. The Romans had come in a couple centuries earlier and taken over Jerusalem. They were in charge. They're the ones who held the power. So you've got this court of Sanhedrin who's got a little bit of power, but really they are sort of a puppet government under the rule of the Romans. So we've got the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is a court of 24 judges. You think it's bad appearing before a judge and jury of 12 people. Court of 24 judges of Pharisees and religious leaders. Now, the Pharisaic tradition, what the Pharisees followed, where it comes from, the reason why the Pharisees have all these laws and all these rules and regulations that everybody had to follow. we've got to take it back a little bit in our story. We've got to take a look about 600 years earlier. You've got Israel, specifically the nation of Judah, surrounding Jerusalem, who are required to follow the rules of the Torah, the law. That's what they were given. That's what they were required to follow. And God told them, if you don't follow this, bad things are going to happen to you. Well, they didn't follow it. And guess what? Something bad happened to them. They got taken over by the Babylonians. So many of the people were killed. Many of the people were taken off to Babylon in exile. And so when they came back to Jerusalem, they rebuilt Jerusalem. They didn't want this to happen again. And so you had this group called the Pharisees who sprung up, and they began to create all these laws. Now, I had a professor in seminary who basically described it like this. If this box, circle, whatever you want to call it, is the Torah, the law that they were to follow, that they were unable to follow, then this would be the Pharisaic laws, the laws of the Pharisees. They created all these rules in extra to the rules of the Torah, basically saying, don't break these laws, because if you break these laws, then you're getting really close to breaking one of these laws. And if you break one of these laws, we are not going off into captivity again. So we get a lot of negative reaction to the Pharisees a lot of times. We think very negatively of the Pharisees. There's a little bit of logic into what they're doing now. If we think about the way that we do things, that we say, well, this is a sin, and we want to flee from sin, so let's set up all these boundaries around it so that we don't commit that sin. It's kind of the same thing. So there is some logic. Now, the problem with the Pharisees is that they were completely missing the point. They were completely missing the overarching message. They were looking at the individual lines without seeing the overall picture. And that's where the Pharisees lost it. But the Pharisees really, in many ways, wanted to protect the people. The Pharisaic law was not written down at the time of Jesus. It was an oral tradition. It was verbally spoken. You were required to follow these laws. Now, after Jesus died, about 40 years or so after Jesus' death and resurrection, the Jews revolted against Rome. Rome came through, wiped out Jerusalem, tore everything down, and the people, the Jews of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas scattered. In the centuries, a couple centuries after this, probably about 150 years after this, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, realized that their oral tradition was insufficient, that they were losing their rules, which seems a little bit pointless at this point because the rules were created to prevent them from losing Jerusalem, and Jerusalem had already been destroyed. That's a different story. But what the Pharisees, about the year 200, decided to do is to write them down. And so they wrote them down into what's today called the Talmud. Now, the first part of that is called the Mishnah, and that was written down about 150 years. And I'm going to read a couple portions from this because it pertains to Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin. These are the rules. The Mishnah covers the rules of the Sanhedrin. I realize I'm getting really technical in a lot of stuff here. Stay with me because it's going to make sense in a minute, I promise. Okay? Still with me? Okay. Verbal and visual acknowledgments are good. In the Talmud, it said that you could only execute a person for murder if there were 2 eyewitnesses. Now, when we're talking about eyewitnesses, this doesn't mean that somebody is committing a crime in the hallway, kills someone in the hallway, and then opens the door and comes out holding a bloody knife. That is insufficient witness for a murder conviction in the Talmud. because you did not see the murder taking place. So 2 witnesses, not just one, 2 witnesses were required actually physically seeing the actual crime take place. Excuse me. But even that was insufficient for a murder conviction resulting in death penalty. If those 2 people had not warned the perpetrator prior to committing a crime that their crime was a capital offense and that they could be executed for it. Not only do you have to witness the crime, 2 people, but you also have to warn the murderer before they commit the murder that their crime is going to give them a death sentence. And not only do you have to warn the person, but they have to acknowledge that you have warned them and verbalize that they are making the decision to go ahead with the murder anyway. That's what it took to carry out a death sentence for murder, according to the Talmud. In other words, it never happened. They did not execute for capital crimes under the Talmud. They put so many rules around it so that they couldn't execute a capital punishment. However, these are not the only provisions for capital punishment in the Talmud. There's another provision called the Talmudic Extra Legal Punishment Emergency Measure. Now that sounds like a name that the U.S. government could come up with. According to this emergency measure, the Sanhedrin, this group of 24 Pharisees and religious leaders, these judges, had the power to act in opposite of the rules of the Torah. They could act completely opposite in the rules of the Torah if the aim was to protect the Torah for the Jewish community. They could break the law if their purpose for breaking the law was to protect the law, which is a nice circular reasoning, which also sounds worthy of the U.S. government. But basically, what this means is that if there's somebody in the community who is a threat to the community or a threat to the law, they could execute that person without due process, or they could give punishments in excess of what the law called for, including torture and what we would today define as unreasonable punishment. Now, to back up with a little more history, you still with me?
Yes.
All right, this is all going to come full circle in just a minute. Prior to the time of Jesus, there was a time during the Festival of Weeks, which is one of the festivals of the Jews, what we now call Pentecost, where a bunch of people had made this pilgrimage and come to the temple. And so you have all these Jews crowd into the temple, and any time that there was a festival in Jerusalem, it was chaos in Jerusalem. It was nothing short of mayhem. And so everybody was on edge, everybody's crammed together. And one of the other things about the temple, when everybody's coming there, is that for a Gentile to be in the temple is considered to be defiling it. So it's really important at the time of festivals that the temple not be defiled. So you've got all these people crammed into the temple for the Festival of Weeks, and a group look up onto the temple walls, and they see a Roman soldier peeking over the wall. Now, the Roman soldiers were always around the walls of the temple, because if there was going to be a revolt to start, guess where it would start? Yeah, the temple, where all the people are in a frenzy. And so they were watching things closely. At one time, Roman soldiers crucified a man for talking too loudly in the temple during a festival because they were concerned that he was going to start a revolt. So these people, these Jews in the temple, look up and they see this Roman soldier peeking over the wall. And everything breaks loose. A complete riot. People are climbing the walls trying to get to the Roman soldiers to kill them. The Roman soldiers, to defend themselves, sent fire to part of the temple, burning it down so that the people couldn't climb up and kill them. Then the Roman soldiers link up their shields and their spears, and they come marching into the temple, killing as they go. Hundreds of people killed. And they didn't stop until they reached the temple treasury, which was emptied by the Roman soldiers. So it didn't take much for a riot to break out, and it didn't take much to give cause to the Romans to come in, to burn down part of the temple, to kill hundreds of Jews, to raid the temple treasury. So now we have Jesus, somebody who just a few days earlier had walked into the temple during a festival, by the way, and turned over a whole bunch of tables from the money changers, making a whip and driving them out. Now, if somebody could be executed for talking too loudly in the temple, and if all it took was a Roman peeking over the wall to lead to a riot that killed hundreds of people, what kind of reaction do you think there's going to be to somebody turning over tables, making a whip, and smacking people out of the temple? So we're going to take a look in the book of John. We're going to take a look at the book of John, chapter 11. You have to remember that after being led away from the garden, Jesus was taken to the house of Caiaphas. So we're going to do a little background on Caiaphas. Very little background. This will be very quick. We see Caiaphas one time before he appears, before Jesus appears before him. And it's in John chapter 11. And we're going to begin in verse 45. This is right after Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what he had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council. Now this council is the Sanhedrin. See how everything's starting to come full circle. See it now? It's coming. We're getting there. They called a meeting of the council and said, "What are we to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." It is better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to be destroyed. So we've got this history on the Pharisees where we talk about the Pharisees and their extra laws and their arrogant nature and the way that they see themselves better than people who don't follow the law, and all these requirements that they put on the law, and they're the people who were on the Sanhedrin that said that they wanted Jesus to be killed, and they were the council that killed Stephen in the book of Acts. And we hear all these negative things about the Sanhedrin. We put them down a lot. Now, I'm not saying that the people of the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees, I'm not saying that these are good people. I'm not saying that they should be absolved of any crimes that they've committed. But reading this and studying this, I began to wonder if this is what's motivating them. If they're saying, this man is a threat to the Jewish people. They're seeing Jesus, the one who's standing up, who's causing an uproar. We've seen this happen before, and it's turned out bad for us. We need to protect the people. It makes me wonder if maybe it's not the crimes of cruelty, and it's not the crimes of malice that should be our biggest concern. Because where the Pharisees committed their biggest crime was in self-preservation. They were killing Jesus to protect themselves. They killed Jesus to protect the nation. In some sense, that might sound honorable. Let one person be killed to protect the nation. But that's where their crime was committed. And so, for us, we might say, oh, we're not going to go out and kill someone. I'm not going to go out and pull a gun in a convenience store and rob them. And because, those are crimes of cruelty. They're crimes of greed. They're crimes of malice. They're crimes of anger. And we don't have to worry because we're not going to commit those crimes. But the crime of the Pharisees was self-preservation. Protecting yourself. I'm going to take you on to the next one, but has everything come full circle? Do you feel that we've connected the dots all the way around?
Amen.
All right. We're going to take a look at our second moment for today, which is the denial. And the denial is the denial of Peter. To follow a little bit of the story, we're going to take a little walk here through the book of John. We're going to turn to John chapter 13 to understand a little bit of this history. And some of this history, some of the background to Peter's denial of Jesus, of who Jesus was, his denial of knowing Jesus. You may have heard this before, and this is an opportunity. This is what the Lenten journey is about. It's an opportunity to walk through it again, to hear it, to see it with fresh eyes. So let's take a look at it again. In John chapter 13, beginning at verse 31. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in excuse me. I will get through this. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another." See, right there, that's the command that the Pharisees were missing. That's what the Pharisees missed. Moving on. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered, Where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward. Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times. So Peter here is making his vow, "I will die for you, Jesus. I will fight for you to the very end." But Jesus predicts that Peter will deny him 3 times. So we're going to jump forward. We're going to jump forward to John chapter 18. And this is jumping forward and jumping back in some ways, because we're jumping forward in John, but we're going back to the garden. We're going back to the betrayal when Jews betrayed Jesus, when Jesus was arrested. So this is in the garden. Jesus has just prayed. Judas has just come and betrayed Jesus. Beginning in verse 7. Again he asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So you are looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "I did not lose a single one of these whom you gave me." Then Simon Peter, here he is again, who had a sword. Now I want you to picture this. I'm going to pause out of this for just a second. I want you to close your eyes for just a second and picture the disciples. They've probably got long, scraggly hair, and they've probably got a scruffy beard, sandals on their feet, probably got a robe on. You know, your stereotypical picture of the disciple. Now tell me where in your picture is Peter's sword. I don't know about you, but whenever I picture the disciples, I don't picture them carrying swords. Peter apparently carried his to pray in a garden at 3 a.m. Whatever. Peter draws his sword, and where'd it go? I lost my place. Yeah, it helps to be in the right chapter. Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" See here, Peter, to an extent, is fulfilling his vow. He says, "I will die for you, Jesus. I'm going to fight with you to the very end." So he draws his sword, and he lashes out. Apparently he's got bad aim because he's only going to be able to catch one person's ear with a row full of soldiers in front of him. Whatever. He was a good disciple, good church leader, bad swordsman. We'll forgive him for that. But Peter is trying to fulfill his vow that he's going to go with Jesus to the very end. But Jesus is arrested. He's carried off to the house of Caiaphas. Now, at the house of Caiaphas, John, who authored this gospel, John was known to the high priest's house. And so John was able to come and go from the house. Peter was not, so Peter was stopped. And when he stopped out at the door, the person at the door says, "Well, you're one of his disciples, right?" And he said, No. I'm not one of his." But he's still trying to get inside. John comes out, gets Peter, brings him in. And we're going to turn to John. We're going to stay in John 18. We're going to move over to verse 25. There's a fire out in the courtyard. Jesus is being tried before the Sanhedrin. And Simon Peter was standing and warming himself by the fire. And they asked him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest. Here's where things come full circle again. Remember that guy who Peter cut off his ear? Malchus? One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. Ooh, that's a little awkward. Asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Now I can only imagine if this person is a relative of the person who got his ear cut off, what kind of tone is behind this question? I'm guessing it wasn't something like, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" I'm guessing that's not how he said it. And given how my voice is feeling right now, I'm not going to try to say it how I think he probably said it. But I'm guessing that it was not a kind question. And it says, again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, the cock crowed. in the other Gospels that says that Jesus was being led from one place to another in the house, and Jesus looked out and saw Peter, and they made eye contact at that moment, and that Peter went out weeping. Now, it's an interesting thing to me that this man who has vowed to fight to the death with Jesus, he vows that he's going to go to the very end, and to the point where he's drawing his sword in front of Roman soldiers, is then just an hour later saying, I don't know him. I don't know who he is. Peter, when he's, his third denial here, the relative to Malchus, he's protecting himself from revenge. And it's self-preservation again. It's self-preservation, a little bit of a different kind, because it's individual. But it makes me wonder if Peter was so willing to die, to fight for who he thought that Jesus was, what changed to an hour later in the garden? Was it his devotion that changed? His devotion that he was willing to die? Or did Peter have a different view of what he would have been dying for? To take a look at this, we're going to flip back. We're going to go over to the book of Matthew, chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's saying to them, Peter has just made a confession. Peter has just confessed that he believes that Jesus is the Messiah. Just confess that you, Jesus, you are the Messiah. You are the one who's bringing salvation. And from that time on, beginning in verse 21, Matthew 16, verse 21, from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And here's Peter's response to the Messiah who said he's going to be killed. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. You, the Messiah, must not be willing to die, because a Messiah who dies is not able to save us. Jesus turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Peter, when he was willing to die for Jesus, he was willing to die. He was willing to fight for the Messiah that was going to bring salvation. But now Jesus was willingly being led off to be killed. And the Messiah who's killed is not able to bring salvation in Peter's mind. This makes me think of maybe you've had a time when maybe when you were younger, you're a kid, and you do something that your parents might be like, oh my goodness, why did they do that? I don't even know who you are. I don't want to know. I'm not acknowledging that you're my kid, because my kid wouldn't do that. I don't know who you are anymore. And I think this might have been a little bit of what Peter's response was like. Because he's saying, I'm going to die for you, Jesus. And then when it comes to it, well, maybe he's really not who I thought he was. Maybe he's not really maybe he's not really the Messiah. Because a Messiah who dies, once he's dead, well, how is he going to save us? Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Peter was expecting one type of salvation and denied the Messiah who was bringing a different kind of salvation. I'm going to take you on. I know I've been going for a while. I'm going to take you on. We're going to go through our third moment here pretty quickly, judgment. After Jesus was arrested, he was brought before Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. And through the hours of the night and into the early hours of the next morning, Jesus gets tossed from place to place as these religious leaders who, as we said, are trying to protect themselves, who think they're trying to protect their nation, are trying to find somebody who will condemn him to be killed. So he's arrested, he's brought before Caiaphas in the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin question him for a little while. They're not really interested in his answers because they're convinced that he's a threat and that they need to get rid of him. So they take him to Pilate, who's the governor of Judea. Now, Pilate has a reputation for being very, very cruel. He's another person who's not exactly portrayed the way he is, maybe in the Bible. The Bible sees him as being, to some extent, a reasonable man, saying, I don't want to kill him because you have no valid charges against him. Well, Pilate was the kind of ruler in Judea who would kill people for smelling too much, or something like that. I'm making that up. But Pilate was a very cruel ruler. He was interested in order. He was interested in keeping the Jews under his thumb so that there would not be a revolt. He's out at the edges of the empire, and these are a volatile people. So he's keeping them under his thumb. And he had no problem sending somebody to crucifixion. So he's brought before Pilate, but something just wasn't sitting right with Pilate. So he's trying to get this out of his court, and he's talking to the religious leaders, and he can't find anything wrong with what Jesus has done to this point. And the witnesses that they're bringing are contradicting each other. And so he's saying, why do you want me to kill this man? Well, he's been doing all these things. He's been doing them here in Judea and also with most of his work up in Galilee. And Pilate goes, Galilee? He's from Galilee. Galilee's not in my region. Hey, Herod, this is your problem. So he sends Jesus off to Herod. And Herod then tries Jesus. And Herod basically comes to the same conclusion that, can't really find anything wrong with this guy, but there's obviously some sort of threat here because these religious leaders are all stirred up in a frenzy. He must be their king if he's claiming to be God. So he puts a purple robe on him and sends him back to Pilate. Pilate finally makes the decision with under the recommendations of the religious leaders that Jesus be executed. And not just executed, because the Romans had many different ways of executing. But crucifixion was the most cruel. Crucifixion is about the most humiliating and painful method of execution that has ever been devised. And even in the Roman Empire, it was reserved for the most serious of crimes. It's not the kind of execution that was given to your common murderer. They'll behead them. That's a lot easier. That crucifixion was reserved for political criminals, for traitors, for leaders of rebellions, rebels, revolts, those kinds of things. Crucifixions were reserved for the people who needed to make an example of. So Pilate makes his decision. Now, in the Bible, it tells us that Pilate could find nothing wrong with Jesus, and simply to appease the crowd, he washes his hands. of them. Throughout history, this has led to a lot of negativity towards Jews. It's led to a lot of anti-Semitism, where people have said, oh, the Jews killed Jesus. Well, crucifixion was a reserved method of punishment. He would not have been crucified unless an example needed to be made. So the religious leaders are telling Pilate, this is a man who is stirring up the people, that he's done all these things in the temple. He's caused all these problems. An example needs to be made. And Pilate, he's a person who needs to keep the Jews under his thumb. He washes his hands of Jesus, but he also sends him off to crucifixion. Washing his hands doesn't absolve Pilate of the decision that he made. By granting a sentence of crucifixion, Pilate was acknowledging that Jesus was a political criminal, that Jesus was a threat to lead a rebellion. So they're going to crucify Jesus not just to get rid of him, but to discourage all of his followers from doing anything after his death. That's what crucifixion was. It was a discouragement. So Pilate condemns Jesus to crucifixion, a punishment only carried out by the Romans. And so the Roman soldiers take him, and we'll continue the story next week. It's a to be continued. We'll have a few more of them. But this is the story. I'm hoping that you're enjoying this walkthrough. Hopefully I'll learn to allot my time a little bit better, and I'm not used to speaking on 3 subjects in 1 week, but I hope that you're taking the time to rest in these moments and to see them, to see Jesus' path, to continue following him. Let's pray.